Like I said, it is so good to see everybody from this point of view again. I know it's been at least 4 months since we were here because that's how old Everly is, and we haven't been up here since then. So it's probably been closer to 6 or 7, I think. But we're gonna continue with the class, uh, and the whole focus of this really is seeing how God's worked in the kingdoms of men, showing that God has been like for Zion's sake, God has not rested. He will not rest until Jerusalem is a blessing in the earth, and the whole earth is filled with the glory of the Lord. So even in these times of relative darkness, as I think we tend to refer to them, God was still very actively working, but it was through the means of the kingdoms of men. And last time we ended talking about the Ottoman power, and the reason we did that is because in this period of late 1800s, mid-late 1800s, when all these significant figures were born, the Ottomans were the ones controlling the land. So in order for the nation of Israel to be reborn, all the foreign people have to be driven out. And the reason we went back to Daniel 11 and started talking about how, back in, we're talking about 1517 here, is because the prophecies that talk about the Ottoman control of the land not only show how they were kicked out, but how they came to take it. So it makes much more sense, I think, to talk about, since what the prophecies talk about how they took it and how they lost it. That's why we're talking about this. Now, I think since we started a little late last time, I was rushing, and I tend to do that, and I get lost when people do that. So I wanted to go back, just touch on a couple things. I actually found some better quality maps, more than 10 pixels, so I put those in here. Excuse me. But if you go over to Daniel 11, this whole slide pretty much shows the different powers that Daniel 11 shows taking possession of the land. And we came, in verses 36 to 39, talking about the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire. And that brings us to about 1453, because in 1453, the Ottomans took Constantinople and the Byzantine Empire completely ceased. So as far as chronologically speaking, as Daniel 11 is, this brings us around 1453 or so on. But like I mentioned, most of this prophecy is in this, in this, in this. There doesn't seem like there's much space accounted for, and a large gap in time. But when we get to verse 40, we get something that says, "And at the time of the end." So it's kind of a break from the general structure of the chapter so far, which I think seems to indicate, or at least make possible, a little bit of span of time. Because the Byzantines had actually lost the land, I forget what year it was, but there were a bunch of different Arabs called like the Saracens, and I probably said that wrong, but either way, I think there's a time jump here. When you look at the phrase "time of the end," I think immediately we think of like the latter days, but there's a bunch of different uses of it. They're all in Daniel, and it seems that you have to determine what it is by the context. For example, in chapter 12, Daniel's told in verse 4, Daniel shut up the words and seal the book even to the time of the end. So all the things that he just received, he's told to seal these things till the time of the end. And we wonder why. And the only thing I can reasonably perceive is that they really wouldn't be able to be understood until this time of the end, because in Daniel's day, we're still back in this map here, where none of this had happened yet. But now, obviously, even I guess many years, not too many years after Daniel's time, they could begin to at least understand some of these things. And also in Daniel 8, I believe it is, the 2300 day prophecy about Jerusalem being restored. That was to occur at the time of the end. So, we'll talk about that a little bit later, but I think the point to take from this is that it doesn't necessarily refer to one thing every place you read about it. It determines on the context. I think it's also significant that Daniel also uses the term latter days. So since he uses latter days and the time of the end separately, they seem to indicate two separate things. But yeah, like I said, I kind of rushed through this, so I wanted to go over this a little bit again. Who were the Mamluks? And I think this is where verse 40 picks up. They had acquired the land in 1250, so about 200 years before the Byzantine Empire even ended, they had taken control of the Holy Land. But what we read is about, again, a king of the south and a king of the north. So, for a while we weren't reading about a king of the north and south in the chapter, but at this time of the end, there's now two powers that one above, one right beneath the Holy Land. These were slave people. That's literally what Mamluk means. And they ruled from Cairo, Egypt, just like all the other, the Ptolemaic rulers, just like they did. So they fit the mold of all the other kings of the south before them. Like I said, I'm not going to go too in depth because we talked about some of this last time. But pretty much what the chapter shows and what this slide is showing is, you used to get this cause and effect thing from it, that at the time of the end, the king of the south pushes at him, or the king of the north. So there's a push against the king of the north. In response, the king of the north comes against him like a whirlwind, and then he just makes this southward push and takes over all these different countries. And even it says in verse 42, the land of Egypt shall not escape, and so on. And these things I think we find in this war. I mentioned last time that the Ottomans were in a process of expanding, and the Mamluks knew this, so they thought really our only best chance to defend ourselves really is to strike first. So that's what they did. This was in 1516 they did this. The Ottomans had they had peace with all their other neighbors, so every soldier they had was able to come against them. And I don't know if I have the sources in here, but according to the Mamluks, this is the largest army they had ever seen that came against them. But the speed with which the king of the north takes over is apparent in the text. It's just almost unopposed, and it really was. That's how it was, really. I mean, the Mamluks. I mean, they really didn't start incorporating guns to their military until halfway through this war. Once they realized, their guns are a lot better than our swords. But also because the Mamluk horses were not used to hearing guns. Anytime an Ottoman would fire at them, it's not just the soldier who's freaking out; it's his horse as well. As far as the numbers go, it was 3-1. The Ottomans outnumbered the Mamluks. There was a one battle kind of up close to the border of pretty much what's Turkey and Syria today. There was one battle there, and with that, they had gained pretty much all of Syria, Lebanon, and half of what was often called Palestine. But the ships are important. Every detail has to be accounted for. And the Ottoman Navy was critical to their success. They followed the Ottoman army down the coast, which I'll show you here in just a second. And they're another big reason why the Ottomans were able to do this so quickly. Here's just an image. This is actually an old Ottoman picture, or painting. I think it was a painting. But those are just what they at least depicted their ships as looking like. I mentioned this last time too, that it doesn't say he shall enter also into Israel, and I think the reason for that is just because there wasn't an Israel. It's called the glorious land. And again, if you look back, I forget what verse this is. Oh, I think I have it on the screen. Yeah, verse 16, there's like 12 Antiochuses. I forget which one it is, but it's one of the Antiochuses in verse 16 here. The land is called the glorious land. So just because it says glorious land doesn't mean that it's glorified by Christ and the saints. It's just a term. Maybe it's referring to the future of that land. It's kind of like Jerusalem, a city of peace. It's been anything but we know it will be a city of peace. So just an interesting note. Now this is just a map that kind of shows. You can see the light gray. That's where the Mamluks made their move up here, and then you see the dark arrow. That's the Ottoman advance against them. So if you just follow in the text, he comes against them, and then he enters into the glorious land, and many countries are overthrown. This is precisely what he did. His incredible speed. Now, certain people were to escape out of his hand, which is really incredible given the speed and the power of them, that anybody could escape them. But there's a couple different Arabs, I guess you can call them Arabs, or Muslims at least, who were able to at least escape his influence. The Bedouins, for example, I mean, the way they live today is exactly as they lived back then. They weren't a threat to the Ottomans, and they were pretty much untouched by them. But what I think is really cool, actually, I'll go back here. Nope, well, let me go back. Anyways, that last slide, it's a book from Islip Collier talking about, again, how the Bedouins and some of these Arabs had maintained their independence, even though the Ottomans had ruled for 400 years the land. But these people, called the Druzes, these were, I guess, the opposite of the Bedouins. Bedouins were relatively peaceful, nomadic. These people were just fierce warriors. You can see some pictures of these people from World War I. They look evil. I mean, they're not people you would mess with. And the Ottomans were so intimidated by them, they actually told them, we won't tax you, we're not going to cause you to be in our military. So, and this is one of their biggest areas here, kind of the region of Edom, Ammon, and Moab. Specifically Ammon, you can see it's a little bit down here, but where the Ammonites inhabited, it's this region here. But that's why I think it says the chief of the children of Ammon. They're not just people living in Ammon. These have I don't know how you'd say it. There's more of a status to them, or intimidating factor, which I thought was interesting. A couple other things on this, as far as they take Egypt, but it's not just the land that doesn't escape. They have power over the gold and silver, but it also says over all the precious things. So there's more than just the gold and silver. And I probably should have pointed it out on a different map. But what the Mamluks had is they had all these trade routes that went to the three holy sites of Islam. You had Jerusalem, Mecca, and Medina. So, I mean, those are trade routes, and those were huge at these times because they had roads. They weren't quite like what we had today, obviously, but if you control trade routes, I mean, you control the commerce that goes through them. So they really had a lot of power and wealth that came from this. And when the Ottomans took the Mamluks, like part of this tax revenue they received was from these highways, but also about 25% of all the food for the Ottoman territories came from Egypt and the land they just conquered. So, and I mentioned this a little bit last time too, that it says the land Egypt shall not escape. It doesn't say that they're going to take the Egyptians and they're going to sell them into slavery. The Mamluk people, they were pretty much unaffected. I mean, they weren't destroyed. They weren't allowed to obviously be terrible rulers or anything like that, but they were pretty much left alone as long as they weren't rebelling against the Ottomans. And it mentions it also at the end here, Libyans and Ethiopians will be at his steps. A lot of historians say that, I don't think I have it up here, but the conquest of Egypt opened up all the territories of Africa to the Ottomans. And so right after Egypt, you have the region of Ethiopia or Kush and Libya. And these are two nations that were under the thumb of the Ottomans and taxed pretty heavily, really, until recent times. You see Ethiopia here until the 18th century. Here we go. Yeah, this is just kind of explaining what I talked about a little bit. You can see this is the result pretty much of the Mamluk 1517 war. This is the area of Kush, and Libya is right in here. So just absolutely remarkable. I mean, these things were written, I'm trying to think how many years ago. So it was about at least 500 something BC, about 2,000 years before these events occurred. God said exactly what would happen. It's incredible. Now this is just, I think I've showed you most of you this before, but because this is a class, and I'm just going to show it again. This guy, he has a channel called Kings and Generals. Doesn't really, as far as I know, he doesn't care for scripture or anything like that. He just loves history and specifically war. So pretty much any war he's ever heard of. He goes through, he does a whole video on them and what happened. And this is what he did for the Ottoman-Mamluk War. And if you start in verse 40, you'll kind of hear some key things he says. Not trying to, to pick out key phrases, but you can follow the progress in the text.
The Ottomans and the Mamluks were neutral through the 14th and 15th centuries, only fighting in a border conflict between 1485 and 1491. This short war ended in a stalemate and the sides signed a peace treaty. However, this peace didn't last long, as the rise of the Safavids and Shi'ism would change the balance of power in the region. The Mamluks hoped that the Safavids and Ottomans would weaken each other, so when the Shah Ismail I sent envoys to the European states to ask for an anti-Ottoman alliance in the early 1500s, the Mamluks allowed them to pass. The Ottomans knew about it and pressured the Mamluks not to allow the envoys to return to Ismail. As the Safavids had decisively lost the Battle of Chaldiran in 1514, and the Ramazanids and Dulkadir were occupied, it was becoming clear to the Mamluk Sultan, Algari, that his realm would be attacked by the Ottomans next, so he accepted an offer of alliance from Ismail I in 1516. Algari marched to Syria, leaving his vizier Tumen Bey in Cairo. The Ottoman-Mamluk War had started. Unfortunately for the Mamluk Sultan, the Ottomans were at peace with all their European neighbours, and Ismail didn't have enough of a force to threaten them, so Selim was able to assemble all of his troops against them. In April, the Ottoman leader sent his vizier Sinan Pasha with the vanguard to capture the crucial passes through the Taurus Mountains, but the cavalry-heavy army of Algari was faster and took control of the passages. Sinan Pasha was forced to wait for Selim, who arrived in Konya in July. The Ottoman Sultan wasn't eager to fight in a narrow passage. At this point, the Ottoman sources diverge from the Arab and Persian sources, as they claim that Ismail managed to send an army to help the Mamluks, but this army was defeated by the Ottomans somewhere in eastern Anatolia. In any case, Selim I decided to bypass the Taurus Mountains and moved to Malatya. At the same time, Algari, understanding that he might be outflanked, retreated from his position to Aleppo. Selim was now marching to the south, and although the Mamluks attempted to make peace, the Ottomans ignored it and even killed the Mamluk envoys, as reported by the Arab sources. The sources are also conflicted about the number of troops. The Mamluks had anywhere from 20 to 50,000 soldiers, while Selim had between 30 and 60,000. The Mamluks had a limited amount of gunpowder weapons and no artillery, but their heavy horsemen were of the highest quality and were undefeated in the field. The sides met at a place called Majdabik on the 24th of August. There are multiple descriptions of the battle, but we will present just one of them. The Mamluk Sultan placed his cavalry in a reversed crescent with infantry in the second line. He was in the centre, with the governor of Damascus to his right and the governor of Aleppo to his left. Meanwhile, the Ottomans placed their cavalry on the flanks, with the light cannons on the right side of the second line, the Sultan and his guard in the centre, and the Janissaries armed with gunpowder weapons on the left. Their cannons were placed on wagons in the rear. Algari's army was in a more mobile formation, and they used that early in the battle, starting their attack in a crescent and shifting their left flank forward. This worked, as the Ottoman cavalry on the right side was forced to flee after the charge of the heavy Mamluk cavalry, while the left slowly retreated under the combined pressure of the Mamluk right and centre. The Mamluk left continued its assault, but was greeted by a volley from the light Ottoman cannons on the right and moved back. The Mamluks shifted their line again and pushed the Ottoman centre. The details are unclear, but it seems that Selim took direct command and achieved an orderly retreat behind the wagons. The Ottoman heavy cannons opened fire upon the enemy, and the Mamluk center was shocked and had to retreat. While this was happening, the Mamluk right finally forced the Ottoman cavalry back, but was met by the Janissary guns. Algari then ordered his left to swing back and charge the Ottomans from the right and rear, but this order was ignored. The sources are inconsistent, but it seems that the governor of Aleppo either betrayed his sultan or was sure that the battle was lost. He left the battlefield, taking the infantry with him. The Ottoman cavalry used the disarray of the Mamluk army. Most of it was surrounded and killed, along with Algari. The number of losses is unclear, but the Ottoman casualties were at least 10,000, while the Mamluk heavy cavalry elite was gone. Selim's conquest of Syria was easy, as the majority of the Mamluk garrisons were defeated at Majdabik. Still, he needed time to secure his position, procure supplies, and allow his navy to join the army in Syria. So he sent his vizier Sinan Pasha in command of the vanguard to occupy the crucial coastal castles. Meanwhile in Cairo, Tuman Bey became the Sultan and started recruiting a new army. He rejected the offer to become an Ottoman vassal, and the envoys were killed. Tuman Bey knew that the fortresses were of utmost importance if he wanted to keep the Ottomans at bay, so he sent his vanguard to the region. Once again the numbers are debated, but the two vanguards encountered each other at a place called Khan Yunis in late October. The battle started with volleys from the Ottoman artillery. Mamluk General al-Ghazali knew that his cavalry would not be able to withstand the Ottoman gunpowder weapons for long, so he ordered a charge. However, this was just a feint, and after the initial clash, the Mamluks started retreating towards the valley to the south. The Ottoman horsemen followed them, and the two cavalry units fought each other in the valley for some time, as the elite Mamluk knights died in Majdabik, and the new recruits were still inexperienced. The battle was in balance when the Ottoman gunpowder units finally arrived. They shot at the flanks of the Mamluk army, and the fight was soon over. The Mamluks lost up to 5,000, while the Ottoman casualties were light. After this defeat, the remaining Mamluk forces were concentrated near Cairo. At the same time, the Ottoman navy finally arrived, and Selim started his march towards Egypt. The journey through the Sinai Desert was difficult, but the navy supplied the Ottoman army, and in January of 1517 it entered Egypt. The Ottoman vanguard took Cairo without any resistance, but it was a trap, and on the 26th Tuman Bey's forces entered the city and destroyed the vanguard in a quick battle. The Ottoman Sultan learned about this on the 27th and sent his Janissaries to retake the city. The local population joined Tuman Bey. The fighting in the city continued until the 3rd of February, when the Ottomans finally regained control. It is said that tens of thousands of Cairo's citizens were killed, among them most of the Mamluk nobility. Tuman Bey continued his resistance for a few more months, but was captured and executed in March. The conquest of Syria and Egypt was finalized. In the span of 3 years, Selim I doubled the territory of the Ottoman Empire. The east was pacified, and the Ottomans were looking towards Europe once again.
I think the Ottomans were all the Euphratean power. And Revelation 16 talks about this. So I'm just going to flip there. I got it on the screen, but I like looking it up in my Bible. Now, again, the whole reason we're talking about this is the Ottomans have to be driven out in order for a nation of Israel to exist, in order for Jews to come. Because again, Herzl had offered to buy the land of Palestine pretty much for the price of all of the Ottomans' debts. So we'll pay off all your debts if you just give us the land. And the Ottoman Sultan would not let him do it, just because I think of how the Muslims held the land and as a holy place. But Revelation 16 talks about this Euphratean power being dried up. The sixth angel poured out his vial upon the great river Euphrates, and the water thereof was dried up, that the way of the kings of the east might be prepared, or strictly made ready. So this is approximately the Ottoman Empire, about 1550 AD. It's not exact, but it's pretty close. And at the time, with this war we were just talking about, they had acquired the entire Euphrates River, and I think that's why the Ottomans were called the Euphratean power. Not only does the river start in Turkey itself, because they were called the Ottoman Turks, but their empire had the whole entire river. That's, I think, very important. Now, if we look at today, that's Turkey's border right now. It still starts there, but their borders are no longer flooded. And I think when it talks about it flooding, the empire expands from the point of the river. Water goes away from the water, from the main channel when it floods, and when it dries up, it goes back to it. And I think there's some verbiage that ties this prophecy in Revelation 16 to Daniel 11. Because it says in Daniel 11 that the king of the north would overflow and pass over. And when you look at that word, it's literally referring to a water, something overflowing its banks. And for some reason, the Spirit determined to use the word overflow to describe his actions. And I think that was for a very specific purpose. In 1517, the Ottoman Euphratean power overflowed their borders. Now back in Daniel 11, and this is, I'd say, more relevant to the time period we're talking about, because this is how they got kicked out of the land. Verses 44 and 45 of Daniel 11 says, "But tidings out of the east and out of the north shall trouble him. Therefore he shall go forth with great fury to destroy, and utterly to make away many. And he shall plant the tabernacles of his palace between the seas in the glorious holy mountain." There's a better rendering. We'll read that in a second. "But he shall come to his end, and none shall help him." So this is, you can see the empire had kind of dried up some. This is what the Ottoman Empire looked like in World War I. So they had lost Egypt. So I think the empire had kind of been in a slow process of drying up for quite a while. But these are some of the major battles on the Ottoman fronts. Now, I think it's important. It's not, tidings out of the northeast. It's out of the east and out of the north. So these are two different directions that we're looking at here. And I think the east, it's not just referring to the eastern front, but we know the whole focus really is on the land. When God's talking about direction, it's usually direction from Israel or Jerusalem. So either way, we find, I think, a good correlation here. So this was called, I'll mention that too. So you have the east here, and then we have, obviously, on the Ottomans' northern front. The east, I think, correlates to this effort by the British. It's called the Mesopotamian Campaign, and they pretty much started on it as soon as the war began. And I think that's important because, there's a reason it says tidings out of the east before it says tidings out of the north. So if this is really specific, and it doesn't necessarily have to be, but I think it is, whatever happens in the east happens before what happens in the north. So it's pretty much as soon as the war began in 1914, the British tried pushing up the Euphrates River here. Interesting, because they're trying to dry up the Euphratean power. And I forget how far they were trying to get up. They ended up getting past Baghdad, but it took quite a while, really. The Ottomans, even though they had been called the sick man of Europe, they were really, really effective at pushing back the British forces, to the extent that the British had to recruit a lot of these other Arabs under a man we're probably familiar with, T.E. Lawrence. He was actually a British soldier. But the Ottomans were very effective in pushing these back. But this effort by the British caused the Ottomans to take a lot of their forces and take them to their eastern front. So there's tidings out of the east, and in relation to the north, there's actually two things, I think. This is the main one, I would say. This was a combined effort by Britain and France to try and just take out the Ottomans immediately by, see Constantinople in the top. Can you see my laser on the screen? Okay. Some TVs show it, some don't. They figured if we could just take Constantinople really quickly, we can take the Ottomans out of the war. And again, this is World War I we're talking about. This was one of the greatest failures of the British and French. I mean, it's one of the biggest embarrassments for Winston Churchill, just because it was so terrible. I forget how many people died. I think they lost 200,000 troops and had absolutely nothing to show for it. The French, actually, if I remember correctly, were so discouraged they kind of abandoned the British halfway through the battle. Yeah, I'm not going by my notes very well here. Oh, yeah, I got a pointer here. Yeah, as long as you guys can see it. No, I can use that one then. That better? Yeah. Okay, I'll just use that one. Yeah, I'm kind of freestyling right now. I forget where I'm at my notes. That's okay. By the way, this is on their northern front. Now over here, I don't talk about it much. This was Russia, the Russian Empire. They had some smaller attacks on the Ottomans. They weren't very effective, but it was cause for the Ottomans to come against them. But this was 1915, so this is about a year after they started the Eastern campaign. So I think it just speaks to the very specific nature of prophecy. And obviously, as this relates to prophecy, it's God that's orchestrating and doing these things. Now, like I mentioned in verse 45, the King James, I think, is really not a good rendering of this, and a lot of newer translations show a more unified meaning. He plants the tabernacles of his palace. When we think of a palace, we think of some big, ornate stone structure. He plants those between the seas in the glorious holy mountain. Tabernacle, we know that just means a dwelling or a tent. And palace, at least the Greek word or the Hebrew word for it here, it's not like what we think of. It's a pavilion or palace tent. So I mean, it's a tent still, but it's not like a soldier's tent. It's one of these big ornate. I think we've probably seen some movies of out in the desert, and they have these big fancy tents, and the ruler lives in that tent. That's what I think it's kind of talking about. But it seems that these aren't like I said, you have all this concrete and build a permanent structure. It seems they're of a temporary nature. And these are just the different verses, different translations. Dang, I wonder why I can't go back. That's frustrating. Anyways, this sums it up. The RSV, I think, reads the best. There's about 12 other translations that read the same. But instead of it saying, like the King James, between the seas, which would seem, between the Mediterranean and between the Dead Sea here, it says between the sea and the glorious holy mountain. So instead of it being between these two and therefore referring to Jerusalem, it says he's going to pitch palatial tents between the sea and the glorious holy mountain. So now we're looking for something in this region and not in Jerusalem. And that's precisely what happened. There were 3 battles of Gaza. This was General Allenby and with I think it was the Egyptian Expeditionary Force is what they were called. But it was a mix of the Egyptian forces and British forces led by Allenby from Egypt, and they pushed up northward from Egypt. The 3 battles of Gaza got them about to here, close to Jerusalem. But these were really the battles that ended Ottoman rule in the land. And just like we said, here's Jerusalem. Here's the Mediterranean. This is where they made their last stand. There's this place called Ramah. That's where they had their headquarters. And they dug trenches in this place called Latrun. I'm not trying to say that. But kind of like trench warfare in World War I, once they had these trenches dug, it was very, very difficult to get them out. And I forget how many months it took them. Because, Israel is a very small nation. It's about the size of New Hampshire. But to get from what we, I guess, would call well, actually, it was from Gaza. From Gaza to Jerusalem. I forget, it was like at least 6 months or a year. Took them a long time to push them out of there. So they really did fight tooth and nail to the very, very last. But I think it's just as the prophecy says. Now, mentioning when I was looking at this, I thought, that's really weird that the blow that would actually end their occupation comes from the south. And why would it not call it out in the text? Why doesn't it say tidings out of the south as well? And I think it is accounted for, but it's just not so. You got to look at more of the, I wouldn't say symbolic, but the imagery side of it. Because we're told he's going to overflow and pass over. Again, using the imagery of a river and water overflowing. And we read in Revelation 16 that the water was going to dry up. And if it overflows from the north, which direction is it going to dry up? It's going to dry up just as it came from. It's going to go to the north. And that's Turkey today. So I think the scriptures do, through imagery, show this. It would be a southward push. Say southward. A push from the south. I always get those mixed up. A push from the south that would kick them out, because that's how they would dry up. Think of that what you will. I thought that was pretty interesting. I was actually laying in bed thinking about this when my eyes shot open. Like, oh, I wonder if there's any correlation there. So just very, very interesting things. But they had the land for 400 years, pretty much exactly 400 years. And now that it had been dried up, this hostile power to the Zionist cause had been kicked out of the land. This was a huge step for the Zionists, because now that the Ottomans were out, and Britain was controlling the land, that was a friendly power. That was probably the friendliest power to the Zionist cause in the world at the time. No accident at all. Now, the whole purpose, as Revelation 16 says, that the Euphratean power would dry up, was specifically that the way of the kings of the east might be prepared, or that might be made ready. And just with other things I've been working on, you guys are probably sick of hearing about this stuff, but again, this is what we're talking about, going from the beginning to the end. But part of what the British and French did during World War I to shore up their relationship was to kind of give themselves an image of a post-war world. So, Britain and France have been rivals and best friends for a long time. It's kind of a love-hate relationship. But it looked like their alliance was going to fracture. So what they did, they said, okay, well, when we take the Ottomans, in the event that we win the war and take the Ottoman Empire, how about I take this half, you take this half, and that way, we have a little goal to work towards, a reason to keep fighting. So the British official was Sir Mark Sykes. He was negotiating for Britain, and Francois-Georges Picot, I think is how you say that, he was the French official. And if you look at Area A, this was to be, originally, these were both to be divided to these powers as colonies. A colony is, it's not part of our home territory, but we own it. But what eventually happened was they were going to become mandates, which we'll talk about in a minute. But France was going to receive Area A and this blue area here. Britain was going to receive this Area B and this pink area here. And this yellow was going to, it was originally, they were kind of determined, is it going to be France or Britain? Since they couldn't agree, they settled on it would be an international body. So at the time, the League of Nations existed. This was kind of an international body. They said the League of Nations will own that. Except for that little red dot, that's Haifa. Britain wanted that so they could transport oil from these areas to Britain. So all of it's international except for Haifa. That was British. But at the same time, as they're telling each other, hey, you guys can have the Ottoman Empire, the British are telling the Arabs in this region of the Hejaz, this guy's name's Ali bin Hussein. He's one of these people who claim to be a direct descendant of Muhammad, and therefore an effective spokesman for pretty much the entire Arab community. So this guy on the left here, Sir Henry McMahon, he was down in Egypt representing Britain, and these two exchanged letters because he had been told by the British government, you guys need to get Arabs in the Ottoman Empire to rise up against the Ottomans. Just because the other wars they had, or other battles, they said, we need help to defeat the Ottomans. We cannot do it on our own. So to strengthen their hand, Britain made these very, very vague promises to the Arabs. Said, yes, we will support you in creating your own independent nations if we win the war. And it was purposely vague so they could go back on them later. But the Arabs thought, these are concrete promises. If we rise up against the Ottomans and help the British win, we will have our own nations. And Britain was really kind of at a difficult point here because the Arabs were at this time determining, do we help the Ottomans or do we help the British? So I think the British really felt that they had no choice but to tell the Arabs, we'll help, we'll give you, your own nations, because otherwise they would have joined the enemy. I think God kind of put all these people in these places and situations where there's really only one answer, and it worked according to his purpose. So these lands here, this is not what Britain promised them. This is what they wanted. So I think that's an important distinction. And then kind of at the same time, that was 1915 and 16, I think, that the Arabs had these promises. As at the same time all this was going on, the British had promised the Zionists, hey, we'll give you what was called Palestine at the time. The guy we had talked about earlier is named Chaim Weizmann, very prominent in British government. He was actually the one who had saved the British war effort. They were acetone, I think is what it was. It was an explosive that they needed for their munitions and bombs, and they were running out of it. So Chaim Weizmann actually found a way to produce this in vast, vast quantities, and so pretty much saved the British war effort. So they really liked Weizmann here. But essentially what they promised is, they said, we will help you Jews form a homeland in Palestine if you help us acquire the Suez Canal. I can't go back, so I've got to be careful with how I change my slides here. But here you can see this is Chaim Weizmann here and Arthur Balfour. This is in Palestine, I believe. Just kind of cool to see these old pictures of these people that God was working with. No, boy, I must have cut some slides out. But I think it's important that a lot of these British officials at this time were Bible believers. I mean, Winston Churchill and Arthur Balfour, they had been raised on the scriptures. So they had a natural affinity for the Jews. And they were also well aware of bless them that bless you and curse them that curse you. If we help the Jews, this will help Britain. And it did. But later on, different things would happen. So we skip kind of towards the end of the war here. This is 1917 with General Allenby marching into Jerusalem. This Battle of Jerusalem, that's what actually kicked the Ottomans out of the land. So this is his triumph over the Ottomans when the land is freed. 1919, World War I officially ended with the signing of the Treaty of Versailles. This is very important. I think a lot of people haven't heard of the San Remo Conference, but it's critical to all of this because, yes, the Ottoman power had been defeated, and that was solidified with the Treaty of Versailles here. But now we have their territory. What are we going to do with it? What's the formal process of how we're going to divide it? That was determined at the San Remo Conference. They all got together. They said, who gets what? And part of the San Remo Conference, that they incorporated the Balfour Declaration wording into it. So this was international law. So the British promised to the Jews that we will help you create a Zionist, I think they technically just called it a homeland, but a Jewish homeland in Palestine became international law because these are all the world powers who had signed this. Very, very important because today, You know, a lot of people say, well, the Jews, they just fought their way and took what they wanted, and that's all the basis there is for a state. No, this was international law. I didn't realize this before. This is originally what they considered Palestine, so it's Israel and all of Jordan today. And as far as the San Remo resolution goes, this was supposed to be the homeland of the Jews. But actually, Churchill later on conceded, and he decided to split it to appease the Arabs. So that's why we have this divide, which is similar to ancient Israel. Although we do know that ancient Israel had land on the east side of the Dead Sea here. But yeah, it was Churchill that divided this and created Transjordan to appease the Arabs. Let's see here. I'm making sure I'm not missing anything important. So they decided how the Ottoman Empire would be divided at San Remo, but the empire was officially dissolved 2 years later with the Treaty of Severus. So it's kind of a weird thing. Why does it take 2 years? But I mean, there's so much. I mean, these are lands and peoples and businesses and economies that how are we going to make all this work? So that's when the river, I would say, the Euphratean power fully dried up was with the Treaty of Severus. Because now there's no such thing as the Ottoman Empire. I didn't think Woodrow Wilson was a pretty cool guy, but his role in this really made me respect him. He was an ardent Bible believer. I forget what he was. I don't think he was a Calvinist or a Protestant, but like these other British rulers, he had convictions from Scripture. I mean, he had he made some agreement with these other nations, and he called it a covenant, specifically because the Scriptures use that term. So he played a huge role for the Zionists here, and he is actually the one who made sure the promise to the Zionists was kept. Because, Britain was favoring the Jews, but at the end of the day, all they care about is British interests. So, and they were very willing to turn their back on the Jews. And since Britain had promised the Ottoman Empire to France, and they also promised it to the Arabs, and they also promised it to the Jews, there was a huge problem. I mean, you can't promise one thing to 3 different people and make them all happy. But he made the difference. Wilson did not recognize the promise to the Arabs or to France, and the reason was they were made in secret. Nobody knew about Britain and France divvying it up quietly during the war. Nobody knew about the promise to the Arabs. The only public declaration was the Balfour Declaration. And because of that, Wilson told Britain, you guys publicly pledged allegiance for the Jews. I don't know what you said in secret. I don't care what you said in secret. You have to fulfill your public promises. So he held Britain to the mark. You have to keep your promises to the Jews. And it's kind of interesting how this happens. This is on February 4th, 1920, as the San Remo negotiations are going on. So they haven't fully brought the Balfour Declaration to international law, but Wilson's the one who made it possible. So one of his staff wrote to him, and he said, to say that negotiations on the future of Palestine have reached so critical a state as to compel me to appeal to you. He shrewdly reminded Wilson that the Sykes-Picot Agreement was a secret proposed treaty, something the president particularly detested. And then he says, the Balfour Declaration, which you made possible, was a public promise, a venture to suggest that it may be given to you at this time to move the statesmen of Christian nations to keep this solemn promise to Israel. Your word at this hour may be decisive. Wilson didn't hesitate. He immediately cabled the U.S. ambassador in Paris, directing him to see the French and British officials to express the president's support for the Zionist position, and only the Zionist position. Wilson's intervention helped in persuading the French to relinquish their claim to northern Palestine. So, had it not been for him, it very likely would have gone to France. And then the other thing that I think he really contributed to this is the whole concept of imperialism, that these nations build empires and they conquer and things like that. He's very against this. It's I think nationalism is technically the term, but pretty much every person, every nation should be able to rule itself democratically. You don't just take over and tax them and whatever. So Britain and France drug their feet throughout this process. They did absolutely everything they could possibly do uh, to hold on to these territories they had had. But Wilson effectively was the force that pushed them out. Now, boundary-wise, oh, I could have had you read that. That's what I just read to you. um, this is incredible. So we have the Ottoman Empire at the beginning of World War One. They win. They divide it here to Britain and to France. And Wilson tells them to steer these embryonic countries to rapid independence. So Britain and France, they still get these areas, but instead of being colonies where they just say, we're going to keep this forever, they became mandates. And the way Wilson described it as, you guys are essentially to be like parents holding a child's hand until they can kind of walk and do things on their own. So you guys are going to control these areas that you wanted, but you have to do it and build the government so you can get out. That's the whole point. And that's how we have the nations today. It was kind of an ugly process, but that's exactly what happened. So scripturally, the Euphratean power dried up, not so that the way the kings of the east could be born, because otherwise we'd think they'd come out of it immediately, but so that they could be prepared. The way for them could be prepared. So I think, that dried up, it was given into the hands of mediators to prepare the way for these people, and now we have independent kings or nations of the East. I think that's incredible. Now, I think this is also a detail in Christ's, I don't know if it's part of the Olivet prophecy. We really know the fig tree. The fig tree represents Israel, and when it would rebud, then you know that Christ's return is near. But it says in Luke 21, behold the fig tree and all the trees. So, it says that for a reason. And I think, it's around this same time, not only Israel was born, all these other nations. This is the 20s, 30s, and 40s that Transjordan, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, that's when these nations were born. So, behold the fig tree and all the trees. When you see these things shoot forth, that summer is nigh at hand. Likewise, ye, when ye see these things come to pass, know ye that the kingdom of God is nigh at hand. Verily I say unto you, this generation shall not pass away till all be fulfilled. Heaven and earth shall pass away, but my words shall not pass away. And we think of that generation as, when these are reborn, a generation scripturally, at least one way to see it scripturally, is about 70 years, if by reason of strength, 80. So Israel 75 this year, I believe. So we expect, a generation, about 80 years, that would not pass without all these things being fulfilled. So we're getting very close to the end of that, and we'll see if that's a correct interpretation or not. The signs in the world certainly would lend to that, I think. Now, let's see how far I want to go here. Yeah, so this is getting into the 12th chapter of Daniel. I think it's important to note that these nations didn't exist in Brother Thomas's time. He didn't expect them to be born. He expected Britain to kind of have these areas, which they did for a little while, but that's when he thought Russia would come down. So a lot has happened, obviously, since Brother Thomas fell asleep. So as students, we need to constantly be evaluating things that happen in light of scriptures, obviously based strictly in the scriptures. But carrying into the 12th chapter of Daniel, we know the chapter divisions were not there originally. Those were put there by the translators. And I think it's a bad division here, because I don't think the division should take place till after verse 4. But if you continue, it says, the king of the north comes to his end, none to help him. And at that time shall Michael stand up, the great prince, which standeth for the children of thy people. And there shall be a time of trouble, such as never was since there was a nation, even to that same time. And at that time thy people shall be delivered, every one that shall be found written in the book. I really believe that this is not Jesus, but Michael, as it says. And there's a couple of reasons for that. Um, we know this discourse between the angel and Daniel starts back in chapter 10, and the literal archangel Michael is mentioned. So I think that's significant. But probably most importantly, again, we've seen that this is chronologically. Michael stands up after the king of the north come to his end. It's at that time, after he comes to his end, that is when Michael stands up. And I think when we think of this, at least in the traditional view, this is talking about Christ standing up and destroying Gog. But if that's the case, Gog comes to his end before Christ even stands up. So it doesn't work there. And again, just the fact that the whole chapter is so chronological and strictly chronological, I think helps with this. And obviously, it's been over 100 years since the King of the North came to an end, and Christ has yet to stand up in the sense of returning and really actively conquering the earth. But if you read these verses, we're not going to look them up today, but I think these are talking about Michael. In Exodus 13, this is when God tells the children of Israel, I'm going to bring you to the land, and I think that's key. When I bring you to the land, I'm going to send my angel before you. It was the angel and the pillar of smoke and the pillar of fire that led the way. My name's going to be in him. You obey him. He has the power to rebuke you. I think that was Michael. His role was to bring Israel to the promised land. In Joshua 5, that's when Joshua goes, I forget what city it is, before Jericho, maybe it was. He sees this angel standing there with his sword drawn. And he says, are you for us or against us? He said, neither. I, as captain of the Lord's host, that's who I stand for. So I think Michael, in the Old Testament time, when they were bringing the Jews back to the land, that was kind of his central role. So when the Jews were to come back to the land in these times, it would make sense to me that is still Michael's role. So now that the land has been cleared of the Ottomans, he doesn't have to sit anymore and work. He stands up to take a kind of a, you can do some work sitting down, but you can do a lot more standing up. And it's from this point that the pace really, really picks up. So I'm just probably, we'll see what this next slide is. Yeah, we'll stop there because otherwise we get into a whole another chunk of meat. But it's just incredible. I mean, I try to cite sources that are not from Bible websites just because if secular history admits these things and it lines up perfectly with Scripture, that's even more evidence that the Scriptures are true. And if God can work in the kingdoms of men so minutely, and how complicated governments and things can be, just think how he can work in our individual small lives. It really is a testament to his power and his care and his dedication to his grand purpose of filling the earth with his glory. And we know we're not there yet, but as surely as we've seen a lot of these other things fulfilled, everything else will be fulfilled just as perfectly. So next time we'll start talking about the role of Britain and some of the prophecies that seem to suggest what their role would be. And we'll pick up, it'll probably be, it's in the mid-20s that we'll pick up, 20s and 30s. We'll just keep progressing forward in time.